In January of 1936, a resolution was read into the record of the United States House of Representatives. It named a place in West Virginia, a contractor, a power company, and a number. 476 tunnel workers, the resolution said, had died from silicosis after digging through Gauley Mountain. The same page claimed that 169 workers had been buried in a field with corn stalks as grave markers and no other means of identification. It looked like an official total. It was not a final count. The witnesses who followed explained why no final count could be made. Men had left the job and scattered across the country. Some deaths had been recorded as pneumonia. An undertaker's records were said to have been destroyed. Many of the workers were black migrants from the South, hired for short stretches and sent back into a nation with no single system capable of following them. Decades later, researchers would produce higher estimates. The numbers would rise from 109 to 476 to 764, and in some accounts to more than 1,000. Each number came from a different boundary around the dead. This is not a search for the largest possible number. It is a search for what each number could see, what it could not see, and why men could die from the same tunnel without ever entering the same record. Subscribe for documentaries that follow the record, where the familiar story stops. The usual account of Hawk's Nest begins with white dust. It tells of men drilling almost pure silica, of workers emerging from a tunnel so coated that their clothes and skin seem to merge beneath the powder, and of a disease that could destroy healthy lungs with terrifying speed. That account is true in its essential shape, yet it can make the disaster feel like one terrible room, one terrible decision, and one terrible moment. Hawk's Nest was more complicated. It was a power project, a construction contract, an industrial quarry, a labor migration, a medical crisis, a series of court cases, a congressional investigation, and finally, a broken act of counting. The tunnel still exists. Water from the New River still passes through Gauley Mountain, following the route cut by men who worked there during the first years of the Great Depression. From an engineering point of view, the project succeeded. It redirected the river toward generators and supplied power for an industrial plant at Alloy. From the perspective of the workers' lungs, it was a machine that converted stone into dust and time into exposure. From the perspective of the surviving record, it became something stranger. It created a large population of sick men at the very moment that the employment system was losing track of them. To understand that contradiction, begin above ground. The New River runs through steep country. Near Hawk's Nest, the river bends around Gauley Mountain before joining the Gauley River and becoming the Kanawha. A hydroelectric engineer, looking at that bend, could see an opportunity. If water entered the mountain on the upstream side and emerged farther down, gravity could do work that the river's longer path around the mountain could not. The proposed tunnel would shorten the route and create a useful drop. Water would drive generators. Electricity would travel to the metals plant at Alloy. The plan joined mountain, river, tunnel, power station, and furnace into one industrial system. The corporate map mattered. The new Kanawha Power Company developed the project. It was connected to Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation, whose industrial interests included the plant that would use the electricity. Reinhardt and Dennis, a construction firm based in Virginia, received the tunnel contract. This division gave the project several layers of authority. One company owned the larger industrial purpose. Another managed the power development. A contractor hired and directed the labor force that drove the tunnel. When illness and death later became subjects of litigation, those layers also became boundaries, across which responsibility could be argued. Work began in 1930. The country was entering an economic collapse that would leave millions without secure employment. A tunnel job in West Virginia could therefore pull men from far beyond the immediate towns. Local workers came. So did migrants from Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and other parts of the South. Many were black men moving through a labor market shaped by segregation and scarcity. The project did not need a stable community of long-term employees. It needed a stream of bodies willing to take dangerous work, because safer work was scarce. The scale can be described in several ways, and even here the boundaries change. Later summaries often say that close to 5,000 men worked somewhere on the overall project. A more specific historical count records 2,982 men who worked underground drilling and blasting. Only about 2/5 of that underground labor force remained for more than 2 months. Only about 1/5 remained for more than 6 months. Turnover was not a side detail. It was one of the central mechanisms of the later counting problem. A worker could arrive, be placed in a crew, spend weeks breathing dust, become unable to keep pace, and disappear from the contractor's active role before the full disease declared itself. Employment records could tell a company who had been paid on a particular day. They were much less capable of telling a future investigator what happened to that worker after he left West Virginia. A payroll has edges. A disease does not respect them. The tunnel was enormous by the standards of a human body. It ran for more than 3 miles through the mountain and was wide enough for crews, drills, rail cars, engines, pipes, and blasted rock to move through its headings. Workers attacked the mountain from more than one direction so that separate crews could meet within it. The advance depended on a repeating cycle. Holes were drilled into the face. Explosives were placed. The blast broke the rock. Men and machines cleared the debris. Then the drills moved forward and began again. That cycle produced speed, but it also produced dust. The rock in much of the tunnel contained more than 90% silica. In some headings, the congressional subcommittee later found that the proportion reached as high as 99%. This was not ordinary soil drifting through open air. The drills fractured quartz-rich stone inside a confined space. Fine particles could remain suspended, where men breathed hard through long shifts. Blasting added smoke. Gasoline motors added exhaust. Inadequate ventilation allowed the mixture to linger. The danger of silica was not unknown. By the time work began at Hawk's Nest, physicians, mining engineers, and the United States Bureau of Mines had already described silicosis and methods of prevention. Wet drilling could keep much of the dust from becoming airborne. Ventilation could move contaminated air away from the workface. Suction equipment could capture dust near the drill. Respiratory protection had limits, especially in extreme concentrations, but it was another layer of defense. The important historical question is therefore not whether modern science had arrived too late. It is why known controls failed to protect the ordinary tunnel workers. That question leads directly to the structure of the project. Hawk's Nest was licensed as a civil engineering development rather than treated as a mine. The distinction sounds technical, but it changed which safety rules and inspectors could reach the work. The men were cutting rock from a mountain, and part of the high-grade silica was preserved for industrial use. Yet the project occupied a legal category that did not bring even the modest mining protections then available. The tunnel existed physically under the mountain and administratively between systems. The silica itself also changed the meaning of the excavation. At first, rock was the obstacle that had to be removed so water could pass. Once exceptionally pure silica was identified, part of that rock became useful material. Testimony before Congress described an enlargement of the tunnel in the richest section so that more silica could be taken out. The material was moved toward the industrial operation at Alloy. A passage for water was also an extraction site. It would be easy to turn that fact into a simple claim that every safety decision was made to obtain valuable silica. The surviving evidence does not permit that shortcut. The power project was real, the tunnel was necessary to it, and the contractor had powerful incentives to complete the work quickly. Silica extraction was an additional industrial benefit, and an additional reason the composition of the rock mattered. The record supports a system of aligned pressures. Speed saved labor and time. Dry drilling advanced faster than wet drilling. Pure silica made the excavated rock useful. Depression labor made replacement workers easy to find. A weak regulatory category reduced external restraint. No single pressure explains the entire disaster. Together they describe the conditions in which it became possible. The project could measure feet of tunnel driven, tons of rock removed, water flow, electrical output, wages, and contract costs. It could recognize progress with precision. It did not build an equally precise way to follow the health of a worker after he left the heading. That imbalance is the first answer in the story. Hawk's Nest was not unmeasured. It was intensely measured, where measurement served construction. The missing count was not caused by a general absence of records. It emerged from records designed for different purposes. Payrolls measured labor while it was useful. Engineering reports measured the mountain while it resisted. Court files measured claims that reached a lawyer. Death certificates measured the diagnoses written where a man happened to die. Burial records measured the bodies an undertaker received. None of those systems alone measured every person whose lungs had been injured underground. Before the numbers can be compared, the men have to be returned to the center of the account. They did not enter the tunnel as statistical units. They entered because a job promised wages during a national emergency. Some came from nearby coal communities and believed tunnel construction might avoid the familiar dangers of falling rock and mine gas. Others came north through segregated labor routes with little reason to expect that an employer would preserve their names after the job ended. Their different starting points would shape what happened when the dust began to follow them home. The men who arrived at Gauley Bridge entered a landscape already organized by industry. Rail lines followed the river. Coal towns and company settlements had taught generations of workers how quickly housing, stores, doctors, and law could become extensions of employment. Hawk's Nest added temporary camps near a construction project whose labor needs could rise and fall by the week. A man might be underground soon after he arrived. He might be gone before anyone outside his crew learned much about him. The surviving accounts describe a workforce divided by race and job. Black migrants formed a large majority of the underground labor force, while white workers were more visible in some skilled, supervisory, and local positions. Exact proportions differ by source and by the boundary used. The National Park Service states that at least 2/3 of the workers were African American. Other historical accounts put the black share of the migrant tunnel force still higher. The safe conclusion is not a perfect percentage. It is that the most exposed underground work fell disproportionately on black men whose mobility later made them difficult to trace. Race shaped more than who held a drill. It shaped housing, wages, access to local institutions, burial, and the value assigned to a claim. Congress heard testimony that settlement amounts were graduated partly by race, with white claimants receiving more than black claimants under the same medical classification. That testimony must be treated as testimony, not converted into a complete accounting of every settlement. Even within that boundary, it reveals something essential. The system did not merely fail to treat the workers as equal after they became sick. It had never treated them as equally countable lives. Many migrants lived in temporary quarters separated from white workers and from the towns around them. These camps were not stable addresses that a later researcher could follow through city directories or property records. A bunk, a shack, or a place in a camp tied a man to the project only while he remained employed. When he left, the address often vanished with the relationship. A name written phonetically on a payroll could change spelling in a hospital, a court petition, or a death certificate. A common name could refer to several people. A nickname could disappear completely. The online archive known as Hawk's Nest Names makes this problem visible. Its list of workers and death certificates is explicitly described as a fraction of the dead. It brings together company lists, undertaker records, state vital records, and later family contributions. Some entries include age, race, and burial place. Some link to a death certificate. Others preserve only a name and a small number of details. The archive warns that it generally does not include men who died after employment ended or outside West Virginia. That warning is not a weakness in the project. It is the most honest statement the record can make. Consider what a complete list would require. First, an investigator would need the full name of every person who worked underground. Then the investigator would need to distinguish men who shared a name, correct spelling errors, and connect aliases. Next would come the dates and locations of exposure, the jobs performed, and the intensity of dust at each heading. After employment, the investigator would need to follow every worker wherever he traveled. If the man died, someone would need to identify the cause, distinguish acute silicosis from pneumonia, tuberculosis, heart disease, or other conditions, and connect that death back to the tunnel. No institution at Hawk's Nest performed that work. The contractor's responsibility, as the company later framed it, could be narrowed to employees and to the period of the contract. A local doctor saw the patient who reached the office. A county registrar recorded the death presented within that county. A lawyer represented the claimant, who found the lawyer and entered a case. A congressional committee heard the witnesses who could travel to Washington or whose testimony was introduced. Every source selected a different population. That is why turnover matters twice. It increased exposure by making workers replaceable, and it reduced visibility by moving injured men beyond the place where the injury occurred. A stable workforce can produce medical patterns even when an employer resists them. The same names recur in payrolls, hospital files, union records, and local obituaries. A migrant workforce fragments those connections. The disease remains in the body, while the paper trail breaks at each move. The short average tenure might appear to have protected workers. In ordinary chronic silicosis, disease often follows years of exposure. Hawk's Nest produced a different clinical reality. The concentration of freshly fractured silica was so high that some men developed severe illness after only months. Modern occupational health sources describe acute silicosis as a form that can appear after a few weeks to several years of exposure to very high concentrations. The rapid cases at Gauley Bridge helped make that form of disease nationally visible. This speed created confusion as well as terror. A strong man could take a job that seemed temporary, work for a season, and become breathless before his family understood that the tunnel had changed his future. Shortness of breath, weakness, cough, weight loss, and vulnerability to infection did not announce one simple diagnosis to every doctor. Pneumonia could be the immediate event written on a death certificate, even when dust-damaged lungs had made the infection overwhelming. Tuberculosis could coexist with silicosis. An X-ray could show damage without answering every question of cause. The medical uncertainty was real, but it did not erase the workplace hazard. In the congressional hearing, a physician explained that diagnosis depended on more than an image. Exposure history, symptoms, examination, and tests mattered together. He also emphasized that extreme concentrations could produce disease far faster than the familiar chronic pattern. The committee did not need to claim that every respiratory death near Gauley Bridge came from the tunnel in order to see a mass occupational crisis. The question was how many deaths could be attributed with confidence, and how many likely remained beyond proof. The workers themselves understood the environment before they had the language of occupational medicine. Testimony described dust so dense that visibility fell to a few feet. Men left the tunnel covered with a white coating. Water carried near the drills collected sediment. A worker did not need to know the size of a respirable particle to know that the air was wrong. Yet recognizing danger and proving legal causation were different acts. One happened in the lungs. The other required a record. Charles Jones gave Congress a grounded account of that gap. He said he had worked in the tunnel off and on for about 14 months, carrying water and helping move steel to the drills. By the time of the hearing, he could not walk far or climb a hill without losing his breath. Doctors had told him not to work. When asked about masks, he said he had not worn one. He remembered seeing engineers use them, not the ordinary workers around him. Jones was not presented as a statistic. He appeared as a man whose capacity to earn had been taken from him. The hearing also brought his family into view. 3 sons, Shirley, Cecil, and Owen, had worked on the project and died within a little more than a year of one another. Their mother described the household consequences of illness, death, and poverty. The testimony contains dramatic statements about what family members said and believed. Those statements are historically valuable, but they are recollections recorded after loss. The secure ground is the family pattern itself. Several men from one household entered the same work, became sick, and died. The Jones family demonstrates why a human engine is necessary in a story dominated by disputed totals. A total can expand or contract depending on method. A household cannot be averaged away. The deaths of the sons, the father's impaired breathing, and the mother's effort to survive reveal the same causal chain at a scale the record can hold. The tunnel created exposure. Exposure created disease. Disease destroyed the ability to work. Lost work pushed the family toward relief. Then the machinery of relief imposed its own distance and humiliation. Mrs. Jones told the committee that obtaining a relief check could require a journey of many miles. The hearing paused over whether a woman in her condition had been expected to make that trip. The exchange may seem far from the tunnel, but it shows the disaster spreading into another institution. Once an injured worker could no longer produce value for the construction project, his survival became a problem for family members and public assistants. Responsibility moved outward while the body remained damaged. That movement was repeated across the workforce. Some men returned to families in the South. Some sought other jobs and failed medical examinations. Some entered lawsuits. Some died in West Virginia. Some died elsewhere. Some were buried as paupers. Some survived for years with impaired lungs. The tunnel's human cost did not arrive in one synchronized event. which is one reason the disaster never acquired the clear public boundary of an explosion or collapse. An explosion has a date. It has a scene that can be sealed, searched, photographed, and counted. Hawk's Nest was an epidemic created by work. Exposure accumulated by shift. Symptoms appeared at different speeds. Men left at different moments. Deaths occurred across several years and many jurisdictions. The beginning could be attached to construction, but the end could not. The tunnel was completed while the disaster was still traveling. This difference shaped public memory. A collapsed mine produces an immediate rescue narrative. Names appear in newspapers while families wait. An occupational disease produces arguments about diagnosis, latency, prior health, and which employer is liable. The death may happen months after the worker disappears from the workplace. By then, the project can point to completion. The contractor can point to the end of employment. The doctor can point to the immediate infection. The death certificate can point to the county where the man died. Each statement can be narrow and still leave the whole truth uncounted. At Hawk's Nest, the visible body of evidence grew slowly. Families noticed clusters. Doctors saw patients. Lawyers assembled claims. Social workers collected accounts. Newspapers eventually carried the story beyond the region. Congress gathered testimony. The sequence matters because it shows that national recognition did not begin with a complete official investigation. It began with scattered people forcing separate fragments into the same frame. Before those fragments reached a hearing room, they were created underground. The next question is therefore mechanical. What did the crews do? What protections were known? And what choices turned a construction site into a place where a short job could produce a fatal lung disease? The answer lies at the drill face, where speed, dust, and unequal protection became visible at the same time. Inside a hard rock tunnel, the face is where the mountain is being turned into space. Crews cannot simply carve a smooth passage forward. They drill a pattern of holes, load explosives, clear the heading, and remove the broken stone. Every new advance exposes another surface. The faster that cycle repeats, the faster the contract approaches completion. It also means more drilling, more blasting, and more dust released into the same enclosed air. At Hawk's Nest, the composition of the rock magnified every part of that cycle. The congressional subcommittee later found that most of the tunnel passed through material containing more than 90% silica, with some sections reaching as high as 99%. Silica is common in the earth, but concentration, particle size, and exposure determine danger. A block of quartz in the mountain is not the same thing as a cloud of freshly fractured particles suspended at breathing height. The particles that matter most are small enough to pass deep into the lungs. A worker could see the larger dust, taste it, feel it on his skin, and wash it from his clothes. The most dangerous fraction included particles too small for ordinary sight. They traveled with each breath into delicate air spaces. The body responded to the injury, but the response could itself damage the lung. In chronic silicosis, scar tissue forms over time and reduces the lung's ability to function. In acute disease after overwhelming exposure, the clinical pattern can develop far more rapidly and can fill the lungs with damaging material. The disease is not contagious. That simple fact separates it from the infections with which it could be confused. Men working the same heading did not become ill because they passed silicosis from one to another. They became ill because the workplace delivered the same hazardous dust to many bodies. Tuberculosis or pneumonia could later complicate the condition, but those infections did not make the underlying exposure disappear. By 1930, none of this began from zero. The congressional record includes testimony about silica as one of the oldest recognized occupational hazards. The United States Bureau of Mines had circulated warnings. Engineers knew that dust concentration mattered. Wet methods, ventilation, and dust collection were not inventions waiting decades in the future. The subcommittee's final report stated that the dangers and principal methods of prevention were known to the medical profession and properly qualified mining engineers. Wet drilling works by delivering water at or near the point where the drill cuts rock. The water suppresses dust before it spreads through the air. It creates mud and makes handling more difficult, but it reduces the invisible cloud a worker would otherwise breathe. Suction equipment can perform a related function by capturing dust near the source. Ventilation then has to replace contaminated air with cleaner air. These are engineering controls because they change the environment rather than asking each worker to survive the hazard alone. Respirators are the last visible layer, not a substitute for controlling dust. A physician who testified before Congress explained that simple filters could clog quickly in extreme concentrations. Positive pressure equipment could work, but was cumbersome. He described dust capture at the drill as both safer and more efficient. The point was not that masks were useless under every condition. It was that an atmosphere dense enough to overwhelm a simple filter should never have been accepted as normal. Arthur Payton gave the hearing one of its most important comparisons. He had worked with the engineering staff of the new Kanawha Power Company inside the tunnel. He testified that the engineering staff eventually received respirators while the ordinary employees of Reinhardt and Dennis did not. Charles Jones offered the same contrast from the workers' side. He recalled engineers wearing masks and no ordinary workman using one. The comparison does more than show unequal equipment. It shows unequal knowledge. When one group is instructed to protect itself and another group remains exposed in the same space, the equipment becomes evidence that someone recognized a danger. Payton said, even the engineering staff worked for months before receiving protection, and he later developed silicosis. That fact prevents a simplistic picture in which every engineer was safe. The more precise picture is a hierarchy of exposure and precaution, with contractor labor at the bottom. Payton also testified about what happened when inspectors approached. According to his account, men watching for inspectors would pass warning into the tunnel. Dry drilling would stop gradually, wet drilling would begin, and gasoline motors would be moved away from the heading. He said he had personally seen the operating method change during inspections. This is serious testimony, but its correct form remains attributed. The hearing did not provide a complete log of every inspection or prove that every visit followed that pattern. The subcommittee nevertheless reached broader findings after hearing workers, engineers, doctors, and officials. It found that the majority of drills were used dry, that ventilation was inadequate, that dust reduced visibility to a few feet, that ordinary contractor employees were not furnished respirators, and that gasoline locomotives operated in the headings. It described a general disregard for approved preventive methods. Those findings are stronger than any single witness account, because they are the committee's stated conclusion from the record before it. Dry drilling was faster. The subcommittee said so directly. That does not establish the private thought of every manager or foreman, but it establishes the operational incentive. Time and labor were contract costs. A method that advanced the face more quickly rewarded the project, unless safety rules or management decisions imposed another limit. Where enforcement was weak and labor was replaceable, the cost of dust could be transferred into workers' bodies. Gasoline motors added another danger. Their exhaust occupied the same imperfectly ventilated space. Workers described smoke and poor visibility after blasting. Carbon monoxide exposure and silica dust were different hazards, yet they shared a cause in the way the heading was managed. The tunnel was treated as a place where the production cycle should continue, through air that repeatedly became unfit. The phrase "poor ventilation" can sound abstract until the geometry is remembered. A tunnel is a long enclosed volume with active work at its farthest points. Fresh air has to travel in. Contaminated air has to travel out. Equipment can fail or be poorly positioned. Each foot of advance changes the distance and the airflow problem. If crews keep drilling dry while the ventilation system is inadequate, the heading becomes a container for everything the work releases. Workers breathed harder during physical labor. They lifted steel, controlled drills, moved debris, and traveled through the tunnel. More effort meant more air passing through their lungs. A physician at the hearing carefully refused to make absolute medical statements from assumptions alone, but he agreed that the described combination of extremely high silica, dense dust, long shifts, and inadequate ventilation could produce disease within months. The speed of illness became part of the evidence. Ordinary expectations about silicosis had been built around quarrymen, miners, and stoneworkers exposed for years. At Gauley Bridge, healthy men could fail after much shorter employment. That apparent impossibility encouraged misdiagnosis and denial. If a doctor or official believed silicosis required a long working life, a man sick after several months could be assigned another cause. The exceptional intensity of hawk's nest exposure made the disease more severe, while also making the diagnosis easier to dispute. The contractor and the connected companies did not leave one uncontested account. Union Carbide later assembled a lengthy mortality and accident report, and a separate memorandum responding to the allegations. Those documents argued for a narrower interpretation of the deaths and challenged claims made before Congress. They are crucial sources because they preserve company data and show how the institution defined its own responsibility. They cannot be treated as neutral merely because they contain tables, nor can they be dismissed merely because they defend the company. The company material included employee lists, undertaker information, mortality comparisons, and arguments about respirator availability, drilling methods, diagnosis, and expected death rates. Some of the most useful surviving names come from those records. At the same time, the analysis was built around populations the company could document and categories it chose to recognize. A report can be detailed and still produce a low count because its denominator, time window, diagnosis rules, and geographic limits exclude the people most likely to be lost. This is a central principle of the Hawk's Nest record. Numbers do not become objective merely by appearing in a table. They become meaningful when the population and method are visible. A count of workers known to have died in West Virginia is not a count of everyone who left the state and died later. A count of death certificates naming silicosis is not a count of every dust-damaged worker whose certificate named pneumonia. A count of people employed by the contractor is not necessarily a count of every person exposed around the project. The same discipline applies to the congressional number. 476 appeared in the joint resolution read at the opening of the hearing. The resolution presented that number as deaths from silicosis among tunnel workers. Yet the hearing itself repeatedly exposed the difficulty of calculation. Witnesses offered estimates ranging across hundreds. Payton said he could not give a reliable total, though he knew individual deaths and believed the larger toll was severe. An attorney told the committee that nobody could calculate the number accurately. The record was therefore doing two things at once. It was making a national claim large enough to force attention, and it was admitting that the proof needed for a final count did not exist. That tension would persist through every later estimate. More evidence could establish that the lower figure was incomplete without producing a perfect replacement. At the drill face, however, the uncertainty around totals did not create uncertainty around prevention. Wet drilling, functional ventilation, source capture, and equal respiratory protection were available concepts. The committee found that they were not adequately used. The mountain's silica content was known or should have been known through reasonable care. Workers left coated in dust. Engineers used protection that ordinary laborers lacked. Those claims do not depend on whether the final death toll was 476 or 764. This distinction protects the story from a common error. If one disputed number is weakened, the whole disaster does not disappear. The strongest historical case rests on several independent layers. The hazard was recognized. The rock was exceptionally rich in silica. Exposure conditions were extreme. Preventive methods were known. Workers developed rapid lung disease. Families and communities reported clusters. Courts received hundreds of claims. Congress found grave failures. Later research showed that the official and company-linked counts did not capture everyone. The uncertainty belongs at the edge of the count, not at the center of the disaster. Men were injured and killed by the work. What remains uncertain is exactly how many, under which diagnostic rules, across what period, and within which geographic boundary. To see why that edge became so wide, the story must leave the heading and enter the doctor's office, the family home, and the courtroom, where the same damaged lung became three different kinds of evidence. A workplace disease becomes legally visible only after someone connects the worker, the exposure, the diagnosis, and the employer. At Hawk's Nest, every link could be challenged. A man might know he could no longer climb a hill. His family might know the coughing began after the tunnel. A doctor might see damaged lungs. A lawyer still had to prove that this particular damage came from this particular job and fell within a rule that allowed recovery. The Jones family entered that process early. Shirley Jones was the youngest of Charles and Emma Jones's sons who worked at the tunnel. His illness became the basis of one of the first important suits against Reinhardt and Dennis. The hearing record preserves family recollections about his hopes, his decline, and what he wanted done after death. Those recollections have often been repeated because they give the disaster a voice. They also require care. The words survive through testimony given by grieving relatives and social workers, not through a recording made while he was alive. The documented sequence is powerful without embellishment. Shirley died. Cecil and Owen also died within about 13 months of their brother. Their father, Charles, later appeared before Congress with severe breathing limitations after his own work in the tunnel. Emma Jones faced the loss of sons, an impaired husband, and dependence on relief. One job reached across several members of the same household and altered every source of income and care. The family's experience pressures any theory that treats the deaths as unrelated background illness. A single diagnosis can be mistaken. Several men from one household can share infections or inherited vulnerabilities. Yet a cluster among relatives who entered the same extraordinary dust environment is also evidence of a common exposure. The congressional hearing did not ask the public to rely on emotion alone. It placed the family beside engineering testimony, medical analysis, work practices, and other cases. Silicosis could be difficult to diagnose with the tools of the time, especially when exposure had been short. A chest image might show patterns that overlapped with tuberculosis. The worker could suffer pneumonia on top of damaged lungs. Death certificates usually recorded an immediate medical judgment, not a full occupational investigation. If a doctor wrote pneumonia, a later researcher could not simply replace that entry with silicosis. The certificate remained evidence of what was diagnosed where the man died, not proof of every cause that contributed. This distinction explains why the count cannot be repaired by collecting certificates alone. Vital records are indispensable. They preserve names, ages, places, dates, causes, relatives, and burial information. They can confirm that a person existed and died, but a death certificate is only as complete as the information available to the doctor and registrar. A migrant's work history might be unknown. The connection to Hawk's Nest might not be written. Racial bias, poverty, distance from specialists, and the novelty of acute silicosis could all shape what entered the form. The congressional testimony includes allegations that company doctors did not tell workers the true nature of their illness. Those claims are serious and cannot be broadened beyond the testimony without additional records. The safer conclusion is that workers repeatedly described uncertainty about what doctors had told them, while lawsuits turned diagnosis into a contested financial fact. A physician's conclusion could determine whether a man was considered employable, eligible for settlement, or unrelated to the tunnel. The legal cases eventually used a medical commission to examine claimants and classify disease. Testimony described categories based on the stage of silicosis, marital status, and race. The commission brought a kind of standardization to hundreds of claims. It also converted bodies into compensation bands. A man could be declared to have no compensable disease, an early stage, a later stage, or a condition complicated by tuberculosis. Each label carried a monetary consequence. This was medicine serving several purposes at once. Doctors tried to identify disease. Lawyers needed evidence. Defendants needed a boundary around liability. Claimants needed recognition before death or disability destroyed the chance to recover anything. The same X-ray could therefore be a clinical image, a legal exhibit, and a financial gate. The process favored people who remained close enough to be examined. A man who had already returned to South Carolina or Georgia might never meet the commission. A family whose relative died under another diagnosis might not know a suit was possible. A worker who could not afford travel or legal help might remain outside the claims population. The medical commission could assess those presented to it. It could not measure everyone who had passed through the tunnel. This creates another denominator problem. Suppose a legal record says that a certain number of examined claimants had lung damage and a certain number had died. Those figures describe the examined claimants. They cannot be divided by the entire workforce unless the examined group represents the workforce. Claimants are selected by illness, awareness, location, legal access, and survival. A court file is evidence of harm, but it is not a neutral sample. The company later used mortality comparisons to argue that reported deaths had been exaggerated, and that not every death among former workers could be attributed to silica. That caution is valid in principle. Not every person employed on a large project dies from the project. Workers can die from accidents, infections, heart disease, violence, and unrelated causes. Any responsible estimate has to distinguish association from attribution. The problem was how the company's own boundaries handled missing people. If analysis included only deaths in West Virginia through a fixed date, it would miss later deaths elsewhere by design. If it required silicosis to appear on a certificate, it would miss cases recorded as pneumonia or tuberculosis, even when dust damage contributed. If the employment list itself was incomplete, the denominator would be unstable. A conservative method can prevent false attribution. It can also create false reassurance when missingness is not random. At Hawk's Nest, the people most likely to disappear from the record were also among the most exposed and least protected. Black migrant workers had short tenures, temporary addresses, and long distances to home. When illness made them unable to work, leaving the project removed them from active payrolls. If they died elsewhere, the West Virginia employer might never receive a record. Their absence was therefore related to the mechanism being measured. Statisticians call this a selection problem. Families experienced it as a missing name. Philippa Allen, the social worker who opened the congressional testimony, said she tried to tabulate the deaths and found the task impossible. She gave 3 reasons. Early deaths had been diagnosed as pneumonia. An undertaker testified that his records had been destroyed. Workers scattered across the country once the danger became known. Her statement did not prove a replacement number. It documented the routes through which a count could fail. The undertaker issue is especially revealing. Burial creates a record only if someone keeps it and the record survives. A funeral home might write a name, employer, place of death, charge, and destination. A pauper burial might preserve less. If the paper is lost, destroyed, or never created, the grave becomes a physical trace detached from an identity. The congressional resolution's account of cornstalk grave markers made that detachment visible in a form the nation could understand. The image is powerful enough to invite exaggeration. It should not be used to claim that every Hawk's Nest victim was placed in one secret mass grave, or that a company personally buried every body. The record supports a narrower and still devastating truth. Black workers faced exclusion from white cemeteries. Some were buried as paupers in fields around the region. A group of graves on the Martha White farm later became associated with the disaster. Decades afterward, roadwork led to the reinterment of remains at a different site. The number and identity of those buried there remain incomplete. The burial trail shows how public infrastructure could overwrite labor history. A temporary marker decays. A farm changes hands. A highway crosses the landscape. Bodies are moved. The new cemetery may preserve remains without restoring every name. A memorial can honor an estimate while the individual identities beneath it remain uncertain. Memory becomes collective, precisely because the record cannot fully return to the individual. The same tension appears in language used for the disease. Workers were sometimes told they had tunnelitis, a name that recognized the place but blurred the medical cause. Pneumonia named the immediate crisis. Tuberculosis named an infection that could coexist with dust disease. Silicosis named the occupational mechanism and therefore pointed back toward the employer. The chosen word changed where responsibility seemed to belong. Medical science at the hearing tried to hold these layers apart. Experts distinguished chronic from acute disease and explained that diagnosis required exposure history along with clinical evidence. They did not claim medicine could reconstruct every death after the fact. Their testimony instead made the environmental conditions legible. Extremely high silica, intense dust, long shifts, and inadequate control created a setting capable of producing rapid silicosis. That capability is not the same as an individual verdict. A historical documentary should not diagnose a named person whose records are incomplete. It can say that a person worked in the tunnel, developed described symptoms, received an attributed diagnosis, and died on a documented date. It can say that a committee, or later researcher, classified the death as related. It must keep those evidence levels visible. The Jones cases offer unusually strong links because the family testified, the employment was known, the illnesses were litigated, and the cluster was recorded. Many migrant workers left none of those layers together. Their weaker paper trail does not mean weaker exposure. It means weaker retrospective proof. This is the moral pressure at the center of the count. The people who had the least institutional protection in life also had the least capacity to be recognized by institutions after death. By the time hundreds of cases reached court, the tunnel had become a contest between individual proof and mass pattern. Defendants could challenge each diagnosis. Plaintiffs could point to the repeated shape of exposure and illness. Judges and juries had to decide within rules built for discrete injuries, not an epidemic spread through a mobile workforce. The resulting lawsuits produced settlements, testimony, and medical data. They also produced a new boundary around the disaster. Only the people who entered the legal system could be compensated by it. The court record, therefore, answers one question and opens another. It proves that the crisis was large enough to generate hundreds of claims and expensive enough to draw powerful legal opposition. It does not tell us how many sick men never filed. To understand what the cases delivered and what they left outside, the story must follow the money, the corporate layers, and the settlement terms that converted uncertain lives into fixed sums. The first major lawsuits began while men were still becoming sick. In the spring of 1933, claims against Reinhardt and Dennis and the new Kanawha Power Company moved into court. The cases asked ordinary legal institutions to answer an extraordinary occupational epidemic. A plaintiff had to show employment, hazardous conditions, disease, causation, and responsibility. The defendants could divide that chain at every link. The corporate structure made division possible. Reinhardt and Dennis employed the tunnel labor and controlled daily construction. The new Kanawha Power Company supervised the larger development and had engineers inside the work. Union Carbide and Carbon stood behind the industrial system that needed the electricity and used the plant at Alloy. Contracts could allocate duties among companies. For a sick worker, the experience was one tunnel. For lawyers, it was several entities with different obligations. The hearing record includes portions of the construction contract and arguments over how much control the power company retained. This mattered because an owner can claim that an independent contractor bears responsibility for its employees. Plaintiffs could answer that the owner knew the rock, set specifications, maintained engineers on site, and benefited from the work. The dispute was not merely about a corporate name. It was about whether responsibility followed the employment relationship, operational control, knowledge, benefit, or all of them. One of the early trials ended without a verdict. A hung jury meant that a courtroom filled with witnesses and medical evidence still could not produce a final answer in that case. Settlement followed. Philippa Allen told Congress that lawyers representing hundreds of men accepted $130,000 after the first trial. Another portion of the hearing described the first 167 suits, settling for the same total. Later historical synthesis counts 538 lawsuits and gives about $200,000 as the broader settlement amount. Those figures should not be forced into one false precision. They likely describe different groups or stages of litigation. The reliable lesson is that hundreds of claims were resolved for a relatively small collective sum. Individual awards recorded in later histories ranged from tens of dollars to $1,600. Legal fees further reduced what reached workers and families. A settlement ended exposure to courtroom risk for the defendants, but it did not create a public finding for every claimant. Settlement is often misread as confession. It is neither a complete admission nor proof that claims were false. Parties settle for many reasons, including uncertainty, cost, delay, reputation, and the risk of losing. At Hawk's Nest, settlement had another consequence. It transformed disputed evidence into private or dispersed agreements rather than a series of verdicts that might have built a consistent public record. The Medical Commission helped make settlement possible by sorting claimants into categories. Testimony said the payments varied according to disease stage, marital status, and race. If accurate, that method placed a lower monetary value on a black claimant within the same medical class. The system did not merely count illness. It priced it according to a social hierarchy. For a worker already unable to earn, even a small payment could be impossible to refuse. Litigation takes time. Silicosis does not pause while lawyers prepare. A claimant could die before a trial ended. A widow could need food, rent, or burial money immediately. The apparent choice between accepting a small settlement and pursuing a larger judgment was therefore shaped by illness and poverty. The defendants also possessed a different capacity to produce records. A corporation could hire doctors, statisticians, lawyers, and engineers. It could assemble employment data and compare observed deaths with expected mortality. An individual worker might have only his body, a pay record, a family witness, and a doctor whose diagnosis was contested. The legal contest was unequal before any argument began. Union Carbide's mortality report is one result of that institutional capacity. Prepared in 1936, it ran for more than 100 pages and gathered accident data, employee deaths, undertaker lists, and material on silicosis. A separate memorandum presented the company's argument in narrative form. Another response addressed the congressional hearing witness by witness. Together, these documents preserve information that might otherwise have vanished. They also reveal the defense strategy. The company disputed broad allegations, narrowed the number of deaths it considered connected to silicosis, questioned witnesses, and argued that preventive measures and wet drilling had been available. The reports treated some claims as part of a campaign against the company. Their tone reflected the racial and labor assumptions of their period. A modern reader has to separate the data they preserve from the judgments through which that data was presented. This separation is not the same as choosing the congressional account automatically. Congress heard mostly from workers, advocates, physicians, and public officials who supported further investigation. Leaders of Reinhardt and Dennis declined the invitation to appear, saying they lacked knowledge of silicosis deaths from the work. The contractor later supplied a written response. One member of the subcommittee noted that he wanted to hear the other side and supported subpoena power because voluntary testimony had not produced it. The resulting hearing is therefore rich but asymmetrical. It contains direct testimony about work conditions and a forceful committee report. It does not contain a full cross-examination of senior contractor officials with their books open before the committee. The subcommittee itself said the hearings had only laid groundwork and recommended a more complete inquiry with power to compel records. That unfinished recommendation is critical. The hearing is often remembered as the moment Congress investigated Hawk's Nest and established the death toll. In reality, the subcommittee concluded that it needed more authority. It had enough evidence to condemn conditions and demand action. It did not claim to have completed the full institutional accounting, Public attention was expanding at the same moment. Labor publications described Gauley Bridge in shocking terms. National magazines carried the story. Artists, writers, and activists traveled to the region. The phrase "village of walking skeletons" circulated because it converted an occupational disease into an image the public could grasp. Yet sensational language could perform two opposite functions. It could force attention onto men who had been ignored, and it could flatten their individual lives into a spectacle of suffering. The workers needed recognition, not only horror. A photograph of a dust-covered crew could prove exposure, but it could not identify every person in the frame or follow his later illness. A dramatic article could widen pressure, but it could also repeat numbers before their method was clear. Publicity made the disaster visible, while sometimes making its evidence less disciplined. Francis Perkins and the Department of Labor were confronting silicosis as a national problem, not only a West Virginia scandal. The Hawk's Nest testimony showed that dust disease crossed state lines because workers did. A state compensation system could protect a resident who remained within its deadlines. It was much less effective for migrants who developed symptoms after leaving. The federal government could study and educate, but workplace safety law remained fragmented. In the years after the tunnel, silicosis gained greater recognition as an occupational disease. West Virginia changed compensation law, and national campaigns promoted dust control. The Hawk's Nest workers did not receive the full benefit of the protections their suffering helped make politically urgent. Deadlines, coverage rules, and the timing of their exposure left many outside later remedies. This is another way the project created progress without repair. The disaster could teach institutions how to protect future workers, while failing to compensate the people whose bodies supplied the lesson. A regulation changes forward. A damaged lung does not return to its earlier state. A new filing period does not reopen every expired claim. A safety poster cannot find a man already buried under an uncertain name. The legal history also complicates the word accident. An accident suggests an unforeseen event or a momentary failure. At Hawk's Nest, the committee found known hazards, available controls, repeated dry drilling, inadequate ventilation, and unequal respirator use over time. It concluded that the project had shown profound disregard for worker health. That does not authorize an invented claim about the private intent of every official. It does support a judgment that the conditions were produced by decisions, not by an unknowable natural surprise. The rock was dangerous because of its composition. The disaster was human because people decided how to drill it, how fast to proceed, who received protection, which rules applied, and what happened when workers became ill. Geological fact and institutional choice met at the heading. Removing either one makes the explanation incomplete. The company response attempted to pull those elements apart. It emphasized the contractor's employment role, disputed the prevalence of dry drilling, and narrowed the connection between observed deaths and silicosis. Worker testimony pushed them together, describing one integrated environment in which company engineers, contractor crews, inspectors, and shared equipment occupied the same tunnel. The committee largely accepted the latter picture, while still calling for a fuller investigation. Responsibility, therefore, existed at several levels. Foremen directed shifts. Contractor officers controlled methods and costs. Power company engineers observed conditions and used protective equipment. State regulators operated within a weak category. Doctors shaped diagnoses. Lawyers shaped settlements. Federal officials decided what authority an investigation would have. No single person had to control every part for the system to fail. This distributed responsibility is one reason a simple villain story is tempting and inadequate. It is easy to imagine that one secret order created the dust, and one cover story erased the dead. The surviving record shows something more durable. Separate institutions used their normal boundaries. The contractor focused on its workforce and contract. The power company distinguished itself from the contractor. State law distinguished civil construction from mining. Medical records distinguished immediate cause from occupational history. Courts distinguished represented claimants from everyone else. Each boundary reduced the portion of the disaster visible from inside it. The workers crossed all of those boundaries without controlling any of them. They moved from camp to heading, from heading to doctor, from doctor to home, from home to lawyer or relief office, and sometimes from West Virginia back to another state. The disease remained continuous while the institutions changed. Every transition was a chance for the causal chain to be broken on paper. By the opening of the congressional hearing, 476 had become the public number, strong enough to appear in a federal resolution. The question before Congress was not only whether the tunnel was deadly. Hundreds of claims and funerals had made that impossible to dismiss. The deeper question was whether the nation had an institution capable of gathering the whole event across employers, counties, diagnoses, graves, and state lines. The answer would change the meaning of the disaster. Until this point, the story can be understood as a failure to protect workers from dust. The hearing reveals a second failure. Even after the harm became undeniable, no authority possessed both the records and the power needed to count everyone. The catastrophe was not only in the tunnel, it was in the distance between the systems that survived it. The House Subcommittee began hearing testimony on January 16, 1936. Sessions continued across several days into early February. The printed volume eventually ran to more than 200 pages. It included workers, family members, a social worker, engineers, doctors, lawyers, labor advocates, and government experts. The hearing was not a trial, and the subcommittee did not have the full compulsory authority it wanted. It was an attempt to determine whether a national inquiry into silicosis and public utility construction was necessary. The joint resolution supplied the opening frame. It stated that 476 tunnel workers had died, that 1,500 were suffering from silicosis, and that 169 had been buried in a field without identification. It proposed a board of inquiry with access to records, power to summon witnesses, and authority to investigate similar conditions elsewhere. The numbers were therefore part of the case for giving the government more power. They were claims presented to justify investigation, not the product of the investigation that followed. That difference changes how the famous figure should be read. Congress put 476 into an official document. The authority of the page made the number durable. Yet the resolution itself asked for machinery that could ascertain the facts. If the facts were already complete, there would have been less reason to demand records and subpoenas. The number carried national seriousness, while the proposed inquiry admitted incompleteness. Philippa Allen spoke first. She described her work in West Virginia, the high silica content of the rock, the lack of protection reported by workers, and the deaths she had tried to trace. Her testimony mixed personal observation, court material, conversations, and advocacy. Some statements were precise. Others were estimates or claims she had received from people in the region. The committee questioned her, asked for sources, and entered documents into the record. Allen's most durable contribution was not a dramatic accusation. It was her explanation of why tabulation failed. Misdiagnosed deaths, missing undertaker records, and workers dispersed across the country were not vague appeals to secrecy. They were identifiable failures in the evidence chain. Each could be tested in principle, and each created a different class of missing case. The Jones family then gave the committee a household view. Emma Jones described sons who had worked and died, a husband who could not earn, and the burden of relief. Charles Jones described his job, his breathing limits, medical examinations, and what he had seen concerning masks. His evidence was bounded by personal knowledge. He could say what he wore and what he observed around him. He did not pretend to know the total number of deaths. That restraint appears elsewhere in the testimony. Arthur Peyton knew tunnel conditions and named men he personally knew had died. When pressed for a total, he offered a very wide estimate and acknowledged that he could not say with precision. An attorney familiar with the claims said the exact number of workers who contracted silicosis was not determinable. The hearing therefore contains large estimates, but it also contains witnesses warning the committee not to confuse estimate with count. Peyton's value lay in comparison. As an engineering employee, he occupied a position between management and labor. He testified about poor air, dry drilling, inspection practices, and the use of respirators by engineers but not contractor workers. He also had silicosis. His body connected the protected staff to the same dangerous environment, while his testimony showed that protection had been distributed unevenly. Medical witnesses widened the frame beyond Gauley Bridge. They explained how silica injures lungs, why particle size and concentration matter, how silicosis can overlap with tuberculosis, and why acute disease may appear after unusually intense exposure. They described preventive methods already available. The hearing could therefore evaluate local testimony against established occupational knowledge. The final subcommittee report drew a clear line through that evidence. It found that the rock contained more than 90% silica through much of the tunnel and reached as high as 99% in some headings. It found that the danger was known, or should have been known. It identified wet drilling, ventilation, respirators, and dust capture as recognized protections. It concluded that those methods had been disregarded, that contractor employees lacked respirators, that most drilling was dry, and that ventilation was inadequate. The report used severe language. It said the tunnel had been driven with grave and inhuman disregard for the health, lives, and future of employees. It linked sickness and death to employment and contractor negligence. This was a forceful institutional verdict on conditions. It did not attach a final mortality table to that verdict. Instead, the subcommittee said its work had laid only the groundwork. It wanted contractor leaders brought before a committee with their books and records. The officers had declined to appear voluntarily, saying they knew of no silicosis deaths caused by the work, even though the record showed claims had been paid. The subcommittee recommended additional authority and funds for a fuller investigation. One member filed a separate opinion that clarified the limitation. He believed the testimony strongly showed failures of safety and labor conditions. He also regretted the contractor's absence because the committee wanted to hear the other side. He supported subpoena power for that reason. The hearing's strength and incompleteness were both written into its closing pages. This is the midpoint where the story changes. At first, the unresolved number appears to be an aftermath problem. The tunnel was dangerous, men died, and later historians struggled to count them. The hearing shows that the inability to count was part of the original institutional failure, the same system that divided employment, ownership, regulation, diagnosis, and burial also divided the evidence needed to measure the harm. The disaster was not only that controls failed underground, It was that no surviving authority could follow a worker from payroll to exposure, from exposure to illness, from illness to migration, and from migration to death. Prevention failed before the breath. Counting failed after it. Both failures came from boundaries that protected the project better than they protected the person. Congress could condemn the conditions because that conclusion drew on converging evidence. Workers described the dust. Engineers described methods. Doctors described disease. Contracts and company relationships were entered. The committee did not need every death certificate to conclude that the workplace had been catastrophically unsafe. Mortality estimation demanded a different kind of proof. It required identifying and following thousands of individuals, many already dispersed. This distinction is important because arguments over the highest number can obscure what is settled. If someone rejects an estimate of more than 1,000, the committee's findings do not disappear. If a researcher revises 764 downward or upward, the dry drilling does not become wet. The disagreement is about the outer boundary of mortality, not whether the exposure occurred. The hearing also reveals how official language can outlive its method. 476 became the congressional figure because it appeared on the first page and was repeated in later histories and memorials. Readers often assume an official number was calculated by an official process. In this case, the process opened by reading the number and ended by asking for a more complete process. The printed page gave the figure a permanence the worker's own records lacked. A federal volume was cataloged, bound, digitized, and preserved. Camp addresses vanished. Undertaker books disappeared. Individual certificates remained scattered among counties and families. The state preserved the claim more successfully than it preserved the people behind it. This does not make 476 meaningless. It marks a threshold of recognition. By early 1936, advocates had assembled enough cases and testimony to put hundreds of deaths before the national legislature. The number communicated scale and helped force occupational silicosis into public debate. Its historical function was political as well as statistical. The number also created a floor in public memory, though not a mathematically secure minimum for every definition. Later writers could compare company-linked counts with the congressional figure and see that narrow institutional methods omitted many cases. Researchers could then ask, how far beyond 476 the evidence justified moving? The answer depended on which deaths were included. A mortality count must define at least 4 things. It needs a population, a cause, a time window, and a place. Was the population every person on the project, only underground workers, or only employees of Reinhardt and Dennis? Was the cause silicosis named on a certificate, any death in which silica likely contributed, or all project-related deaths, including accidents? Did the window end with construction, with the congressional hearing, or decades later? Did the place include only West Virginia, or every state to which a worker returned? Change one definition, and the number changes. That is not manipulation if the method is disclosed. It becomes misleading when numbers produced by different definitions are placed in a sequence as though one simply corrected the arithmetic of another. The company figure, the congressional figure, Cherniak's estimate, and the later federal educational claim were not 4 attempts to count the same visible list. They were 4 boundaries around an incomplete population. The House record provides examples of how those boundaries worked. One witness counted men personally known to him. The medical commission counted examined claimants. Lawyers counted filed cases. Undertakers counted bodies they handled. Company analysts counted recorded employee deaths within defined dates and places. Congress repeated a broader advocacy figure. Each source had a capability and a silence. The proper historical method is therefore not to choose the largest number because it feels morally adequate. It is to map each number to the evidence that produced it. The moral failure does not need inflation. It lies partly in the fact that a complete count was made impossible by the same vulnerability that exposed the workers. Black migrant labor is central to that conclusion. If most underground workers had been local homeowners with stable doctors, churches, cemeteries, and newspapers, later tracing would still have been difficult, but not impossible in the same way. The labor system recruited men whose identities were lightly held by local institutions. Their mobility served the project. It later weakened their claims to recognition. The committee saw enough of this to frame silicosis as a national issue. Migrant workers crossed state boundaries. Industrial methods repeated across tunnels, mines, quarries, and foundries. State compensation rules varied. A disease that might develop after employment could not be contained within the contract that caused exposure. The proposed Board of Inquiry was an attempt to create an institution wide enough for the problem. That institution did not arrive in a form capable of reconstructing every hawk's nest death. The hearing remained the central federal record. Its preservation allowed later researchers to revisit the testimony, compare it with company files, and search for names. It also froze the gap. The committee's call for full books and nationwide tracing became evidence of what had not been done. The next task is to examine the numbers without turning them into a contest. 109, 476, 764, and more than 1,000 each entered the story through a different source. The goal is not to announce a winner. It is to understand what had to be included or excluded for each total to exist, and why no surviving method can honestly promise the final name. 109 is the number most often associated with the company side of the record. It appears in later summaries as the deaths Union Carbide calculated or admitted, and it was placed on a West Virginia historical marker near the site. The figure is useful because it shows that even a narrow institutional account recognized a mass fatality. It is dangerous when treated as a complete roster. The underlying company materials were assembled in 1936. They drew on Reinhardt and Dennis employee information, deaths recorded in West Virginia, undertaker data, and medical arguments. The full report covered more than accidental deaths and more than silicosis alone. Its tables were designed to answer allegations against the companies, not to create an open-ended national search for former workers. That purpose shaped the method. A corporate defense wants attributable cases within a defensible population. It asks which people were employees, which deaths were documented, which diagnoses were accepted, and whether observed mortality exceeded what might normally be expected. Those are legitimate questions. They also favor cases with strong surviving paperwork and exclude uncertain cases by design. If 109 includes all known deaths within a company-defined group, it still does not mean all 109 were classified as silicosis deaths. Different secondary accounts describe the internal categories in different ways. Without placing every row of the company report beside the claim, the safest public wording is that the company-linked calculation recognized 109 deaths, while attributing a much smaller portion directly to silicosis. The precise subcategory should be verified from the report before being used as a headline. This is why the episode's title does not say that Congress corrected a company lie. It says Congress named 476 and the count remained open. The difference between 109 and 476 is real, but the reasons include method, not only honesty. A narrow count can be both self-serving and internally consistent. To challenge it responsibly, a researcher has to show which people its boundaries left out. 476 came through the joint resolution. The printed wording treated those workers as deaths from silicosis, contracted in the tunnel. The hearing did not append a name list of 476 people, nor did it show a calculation that could be reproduced from the pages alone. The figure likely condensed advocacy, claims, local reports, and estimates already circulating before the committee met. Its authority came from Congress, but its evidentiary status came from the resolution's recitals. That distinction is not a technical escape. It is the reason the number could be both historically important and statistically incomplete. Congress gave the crisis a national scale. The committee then documented conditions that made hundreds of deaths credible. It did not close the roster. 764 is associated with Martin Cherniak, a physician and epidemiologist who published a major study of the incident in the 1980s. Cherniak revisited medical, legal, corporate, and archival material long after the immediate litigation had ended. His estimate included acute silicosis and related conditions beyond the narrowest company categories. It has become the number used by the National Park Service and the Workers' Memorial. Cherniak's work changed the historiography because it treated Hawk's Nest as an occupational epidemic rather than a collection of isolated claims. An epidemiologist can examine patterns across a workforce, compare groups, and reason from incomplete records. That approach reaches people whom a strict certificate count may miss. It also requires assumptions about attribution and completeness. An estimate of 764 does not mean that 764 individually named certificates all say silicosis. It means the surviving data supported a broader reconstruction of mortality. The number should be presented with its author, method, and uncertainty attached. Remove those attachments and an estimate begins to masquerade as a head count. More than 1,000 entered public circulation through later federal educational material. A National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health training document published in the early 2000s stated that more than 1,000 workers were believed to have died from acute silicosis caused by the project. The wording was belief, not a newly printed nominal roll. Later summaries sometimes described this as a federal study estimating close to 1,000. The safest treatment is to preserve what the federal document actually did. It used Hawk's Nest as a historic case study, while teaching workers about crystalline silica and acute disease. Its purpose was prevention, not a monograph on mortality reconstruction. The figure shows that a major occupational health institution regarded the toll as plausibly higher than the familiar 764. It does not by itself provide a transparent method for adding every case beyond Cherniak's estimate. This produces a hierarchy of claim strength. The company records can directly prove particular employees and deaths within their files. The joint resolution directly proves that 476 was the number placed before Congress. Cherniak directly proves that a later epidemiological reconstruction reached 764. The federal training document directly proves that more than 1,000 was believed within that educational account. None directly proves a complete final list. The numbers are therefore not steps on a ladder toward certainty. They are windows of different sizes. The narrow window shows fewer people with stronger individual documentation. The wider window includes more probable cases, but depends more heavily on inference. Historical honesty does not require choosing between individual proof and population inference. It requires labeling them. Imagine 4 circles. The first contains named former employees whose deaths in West Virginia were recorded by the company through the end of 1935. The second adds claimants and reported deaths recognized by advocates and Congress. The third adds workers reconstructed through legal and medical analysis, including related diagnoses and cases beyond the narrow company frame. The fourth includes probable migrants who died elsewhere or later without a surviving connection. The first 3 circles can be estimated. The fourth can be described but never fully counted. The circles also overlap imperfectly. A man could appear under a variant spelling in 2 sources and be counted twice unless records were linked. Another could appear in a lawsuit, but not on a preserved payroll. A death certificate could name pneumonia, while a court doctor diagnosed silicosis. A burial list could include a person who died from another cause near the project. Every merge requires judgment. Modern data methods can improve matching. Names can be standardized. Ages, relatives, race, occupation, and location can distinguish people. Death certificates can be searched across states. Census records can follow households. Genealogy and family testimony can restore identities. Yet the source universe remains incomplete. Better matching cannot recover a document that was never created. The Hawk's Nest Names Archive accepts that boundary. It presents named workers and certificates while warning that the list is only a fraction. That choice resists the pressure to make the archive look complete. Each name is a verified gain. Each absence remains an open possibility, rather than a manufactured entry. The list contains young men and older men, black workers and white workers, people buried in local cemeteries, and people returned to other states. Some entries preserve little more than a name. Several Jones family members appear. Arthur Payton appears. The archive also includes a small number of people connected to the camps who did not die of silicosis, reminding users that proximity to the disaster is not identical to cause. That detail is crucial. A memorial archive can honor a community affected by the project, while a mortality study must apply cause rules. The 2 projects answer different questions. Who belongs to the history of Hawk's Nest is broader than who can be counted as a silicosis death. Confusing them can inflate the toll or erase important non-fail experiences. The same caution applies to the phrase, worst industrial disaster. Hawk's Nest is often described as the deadliest industrial disaster in the United States. That ranking depends on including occupational disease deaths spread over time and on accepting one of the higher estimates. Other disasters are counted by immediate fatalities from a single event. Comparing them can be rhetorically powerful, but methodologically uneven. Nothing essential is lost by avoiding the ranking. Hawk's Nest was one of the most lethal occupational disasters in American history, and the country's greatest known silicosis catastrophe. Hundreds of men died. The exact number is unresolved. This formulation is strong because it can survive revision. The temptation to claim a cover-up is similar. Some records were lost. Contractor officials declined to appear voluntarily. Company reports defended narrow figures. A witness said an undertaker's records had been destroyed. Later researchers described missing court or archive files. Those facts justify investigation of suppression and institutional self-protection. They do not automatically prove one coordinated plan that erased every missing name. The broader explanation is more securely documented. Migrant labor produced geographic dispersal. Segregation reduced institutional access. Short employment weakened follow-up. Medical ambiguity changed death certificates. Corporate and legal boundaries narrowed responsibility. Burial practices detached bodies from identities. Settlements reduced public adjudication. Missing and destroyed records deepened every gap. Deliberate acts may exist within that system, but the system does not depend on one secret order. This matters to the emotional question. If the story says the real number was hidden and can now be revealed, the ending promises a recovered total. The evidence cannot repay that promise. If the story asks why the count could not close, the ending can deliver something more honest. It can identify the mechanisms that made completeness impossible and show how current archives are restoring names without pretending the work is finished. The number 476 then becomes a doorway rather than a verdict. It tells us that the federal government was willing to put hundreds of deaths on paper. It also lets us ask who had to be visible before Congress could count him. A claimant with a lawyer was visible. A named patient examined by a commission was visible. A body in an undertaker's ledger was visible. A migrant dying under another diagnosis hundreds of miles away was nearly invisible. Visibility was not distributed at random. It followed race, money, residence, family ties, legal representation, and the survival of records. The missing portion of the death toll is therefore not merely statistical noise. It reflects the social organization of the workforce. Uncertainty itself has a history. This is the larger value beyond the disputed number. Hawk's Nest teaches how institutions count harm. A company counts what enters its files. A court counts the claims before it. A health agency counts cases that meet a definition. A memorial counts people a community chooses to remember. A historian moves among those systems, testing overlaps and silences. None can claim omniscience. The most responsible final estimate may remain a range. At least hundreds, with 764, widely used by later scholarship and public institutions, and higher figures appearing in federal education and other accounts. A range can feel less satisfying than one exact total. In this case, dissatisfaction is part of the truth. Precision would be purchased by pretending the missing records exist. The named dead deserve more than service as evidence for a large number. Their identities should not disappear inside a contest over whether the toll was 764 or more than 1,000. Every restored certificate can change a family's relationship to the event, even if it barely moves the total. Naming and estimating are related projects, not interchangeable ones. The difference becomes visible at the burial ground. A memorial can carry one estimate, while the graves beneath it preserve only some remains and some names. The marker speaks for a whole catastrophe. The soil holds a smaller, uncertain group. The distance between inscription and grave is the physical form of the count's boundary. To finish the story, the investigation must return to that landscape. The bodies buried on the White Farm, the later movement of remains, the poetry and labor campaigns, the safety legacy, and the operating tunnel all show different ways a society can remember an event it never fully measured. The count did not close, but memory did not end where the paperwork failed. The burial ground associated with Hawk's Nest did not begin as a national memorial. It began as a practical answer to segregation, poverty, and death. Black workers could not simply be placed in nearby white cemeteries. Some bodies were returned to families. Others were handled locally as pauper burials. The congressional resolution described 169 workers buried in a field near Summersville, with corn stalks as their only markers and no means of identification. That sentence has become one of the most repeated images in the story. Its source should remain attached. It was a claim recited in the resolution, not an inventory produced by an archaeological survey. The image communicates neglect, but the exact number and the phrase about markers belong to the evidentiary class of the resolution. Other records support the broader burial history. The Hawk's Nest Names Archive lists many people whose burial place was the White Farm. State and local histories describe rows of shallow graves. The National Park Service recounts a witness memory of small mounds along a fence line. These sources converge on the existence of a burial field used for black workers, while leaving the full identity and number uncertain. In the early 1970s, highway construction disturbed part of the burial area. Remains were exhumed and moved to a new site near what became Summersville Lake. Later accounts commonly describe about 48 sets of remains reinterred there. Decomposition and the conditions of the original burials made individual identification difficult. The act preserved bodies while further separating them from their original locations. For decades, the new site remained modest and little known. Local residents and historians eventually helped establish a memorial. Its inscription uses the estimate of 764 deaths to honor the larger workforce, even though only a fraction of the victims could be buried at that location. The memorial therefore performs two different acts. It marks a physical grave, and it speaks for people whose graves may be elsewhere or unknown. This is not an error. A memorial is allowed to represent a community larger than the bodies directly beneath it. The important thing is to avoid treating the inscription as a forensic count of the site. The number belongs to historical reconstruction. The grave depressions belong to a specific group of reinterred remains. Conflating them would repeat the very counting problem the memorial seeks to repair. The cemetery also shows why visual evidence can mislead. A camera can record crosses, stones, trees, and a monument. It cannot reveal which worker lies under each patch of ground if the identification was lost. A photograph feels concrete, but the identity claim remains documentary. The image proves that a memorial landscape exists. It does not complete the names. The tunnel presents the opposite problem. Its function is visible, while its human history is easy to miss. Water still travels through Gauley Mountain. The engineering system continues to do what it was built to do. A person can encounter the river, the dam, or the power infrastructure without seeing any sign of the dust that filled the heading during construction. Industrial success survives in steel, concrete, water flow, and electricity. Occupational disease survives in bodies and family histories, which are more fragile. When the generation of workers dies, the project remains obvious and the exposure becomes archival. That imbalance helps explain how Hawk's Nest could be both notorious in the 1930s and unfamiliar to later Americans. The disaster was not completely forgotten. It entered labor culture almost immediately. Journalists wrote about Gauley Bridge. Musicians and storytellers used silicosis as a subject. Muriel Rukeyser traveled to West Virginia in 1936, read testimony and legal material, and met people connected to the tunnel. 2 years later, she published a sequence of documentary poems known as The Book of the Dead. Rukeyser's work did not replace the hearing. It rearranged the record so readers could feel relationships that official pages kept separate. Engineering language, worker testimony, landscape, medicine, and family loss could occupy the same artistic structure. The poems helped preserve names and voices through a period when institutional memory was weakening. Art can do that work because it is not limited to the categories of a mortality table. It can show how a river, a corporation, a tunnel, a mother, and a medical term belong to one system. It can preserve emotional truth without claiming to resolve every disputed fact. It can also introduce its own risks if later readers treat poetic arrangement as verbatim history. The source layers must remain distinct. The survival of Rukeyser's work challenges the claim that Hawk's Nest was simply erased. The story remained available in poetry, labor history, local memory, federal records, and occupational health literature. What changed was its position in public attention. It moved from national scandal to specialist and regional memory. Uneven remembrance is not the same thing as total suppression. There were reasons for that unevenness. The event lacked one anniversary date on which all deaths occurred. Many victims were migrants without descendants in the immediate area. Settlements did not produce a single famous verdict. The corporations and contractor could define responsibility narrowly. The country soon faced other crises and another world war. Occupational disease stories compete poorly with disasters that offer one spectacular image. The race of the workers mattered as well. Black labor deaths did not receive equal public investment in the early 20th century. Families scattered across the South had limited power to preserve a West Virginia site. Local segregation had already excluded many men from named burial. National memory inherited those inequalities. When historians returned to the story, they did more than rediscover a forgotten event. They reconstructed a dispersed archive. Company records had to be read against worker testimony. Court cases had to be recovered. Death certificates had to be linked with variant names. Burial sites had to be located. The result was a new estimate and a clearer account of labor conditions, but not a closed list. The current names archive continues that reconstruction in public. A family can encounter a name, recognize a relative, and supply information. A certificate can be added. A misspelling can be corrected. This makes the archive different from a finished monument. It is designed to change as evidence arrives. The process also produces ethical limits. A resemblance of name and age is not enough to identify a person. Family stories can guide research, but should be labeled as memory until corroborated. A cause of death should not be rewritten merely to fit the larger narrative. The archive gains credibility by refusing certainty when the record is weak. This patient work is the opposite of a viral reveal. It rarely produces one document that changes everything. It produces connection through accumulation. A name appears on a payroll, a lawsuit, a certificate, and a cemetery list. Each link reduces uncertainty. The final result may still be that the person probably belongs to the Hawk's Nest toll rather than certainly does. The regulatory legacy developed in a similar way. The congressional hearing made acute silicosis visible as a national occupational hazard. Labor officials promoted education and dust control. States expanded recognition and compensation. Later, federal occupational health agencies used Hawk's Nest as a warning in training materials. The disaster became part of the argument that silica exposure is preventable, not an unavoidable price of working with stone. Prevention rests on controls that the 1936 committee already named. Reduce dust at the source, use water or capture, ventilate properly, monitor exposure, provide appropriate respiratory protection when engineering controls cannot keep air safe, follow workers medically, keep records capable of finding disease before a crisis becomes a mortality debate. Modern guidance adds measurement that was missing at Gauley Bridge. Air sampling can quantify respirable crystalline silica, Exposure limits create enforceable thresholds. Medical surveillance can track workers in high-risk jobs. Yet the disease has not disappeared. Current occupational health agencies still warn that silicosis has no cure and that rapidly progressive forms can follow intense exposure. The persistence of the hazard gives Hawk's Nest more than commemorative value. The story is not useful because present workplaces are identical to a Depression-era tunnel. They are not. It is useful because the mechanisms repeat. Production pressure can outrun control. Contracting can divide responsibility. Migrant labor can weaken follow-up. Disease can appear after a worker leaves. A narrow data system can count only the people who remain visible. The lesson is therefore not simply wear a mask. Personal protection matters, but the hearing itself showed its limits. Engineers who received respirators were still exposed, and Peyton became ill. The more durable lesson is to control the source, design accountability across contractors, and maintain health records that follow the person rather than ending with the job. That last requirement directly answers the record question. A complete count would have needed a roster linked to exposure, medical surveillance, and long-term follow-up across states. The project had no such system. Once workers dispersed, later investigators had to reconstruct what prevention-oriented record-keeping should have created from the beginning. The absence of that system was not unusual for the period, but the scale of Hawk's Nest made its consequences extraordinary. Thousands of short-term workers entered an environment capable of producing acute disease. The project finished in less time than many cases needed to reach a final diagnosis. By the time institutions understood the epidemic, the population had already dissolved. The phrase "they were forgotten" can therefore be made more precise. Many workers were insufficiently recorded, unequally remembered, and separated from the place where they were harmed. Some names survived in company documents created to defend the institution. Some survived in lawsuits. Some survived in family testimony. Some bodies survived without names. The record did not forget in one motion. It remembered different people at different strengths. The company report, the congressional hearing, Rukeyser's poems, the cemetery, the federal health material, and the online archive form an unusual chain. A defensive document preserves names. An unfinished inquiry preserves testimony. Art preserves relationships. A grave preserves remains. A training manual preserves warning. A digital archive invites correction. None is complete. Together they make denial of the disaster impossible. They also make a simplistic ending impossible. The tunnel workers did contribute to greater recognition of silicosis, but their suffering should not be redeemed as though later safety gains balanced the loss. A regulation is not payment to a widow. A memorial is not a restored life. Historical consequence can be acknowledged without turning victims into instruments of progress. The memorial's use of 764 can be understood in that spirit. It chooses a widely supported estimate, large enough to represent the catastrophe. It does not claim that every person has been identified. The number gathers the dead into public memory, while the archive works in the other direction, breaking the total back into names. Those two movements need each other. Without a total, the scale can disappear into isolated tragedies. Without names, the total can become an abstraction. Hawk's Nest remains unresolved because the archive cannot yet make them meet. There is one final object that connects both movements. The hearing volume begins with 476 on paper and ends with a committee asking for more records. The physical tunnel begins with water entering the mountain and ends with power produced downstream. One system completed its circuit, the other did not, The ending must return to that difference, without pretending uncertainty is emptiness. We know why the work was dangerous. We know the controls that were available. We know the committee's findings. We know that hundreds died and that black migrant workers carried a disproportionate share. We know several reasons the count failed. What we do not know is the final total, or every name. That boundary is not a weakness in the story. It is the story's last piece of evidence. The missing count records the same unequal structure as the dust, the camps, the settlements, and the graves. The uncertainty is not accidental fog around an otherwise complete event. It is one of the consequences the event produced. Stand near the New River today, and the industrial logic of Hawk's Nest is still visible. Water approaches Gauley Mountain. The diversion takes a shorter route through rock. The river's drop becomes power. The tunnel does not look like an unfinished project. It looks like durable infrastructure, performing the task its designers intended. That durability can create a false symmetry. The engineering survived, so it may seem that the history should also survive in a stable form. But the tunnel and the workforce were built for opposite kinds of permanence. Concrete, rock, and hydraulic machinery were meant to remain. The labor force was recruited to be temporary. The project kept the structure and released the men. When the men left, no institution followed all of them. This is the clearest answer to the central record question. The count never closed because exposure was concentrated in one place, while illness and death dispersed across people, years, diagnoses, counties, and states. The employment system knew workers while they were producing the tunnel. It did not maintain a health record capable of following them afterward. Several forces widened the gap. Many workers stayed only weeks or months. Their camp addresses were temporary. Names could be misspelled or repeated. Most underground laborers were black migrants living under segregation. Some returned to distant families. Acute silicosis could be mistaken for pneumonia or complicated by tuberculosis. Doctors and registrars recorded the immediate case before them, often without a full occupational history. Burial records were incomplete, and some graves lacked durable identification. Legal systems captured another partial group. Hundreds of people filed claims, but claimants were selected by awareness, location, representation, and the ability to remain in the process. Settlements produced payments without a full public verdict for each case. Medical commissions examined those who reached them. Company reports counted people within corporate definitions. None of these populations was identical to everyone exposed. The congressional hearing assembled enough fragments to condemn the conditions. It did not obtain every book or compel every responsible official to testify. Its opening resolution named 476 deaths. Its closing report asked for a more complete inquiry. The official number and the official admission of incompleteness belong together. Later research could widen the frame. Cherniak's estimate of 764 considered a broader epidemiological and historical record. Federal training material later said more than 1,000 were believed to have died. These figures are evidence that the company-linked count was not the outer boundary. They remain estimates, not complete rolls. The truthful answer is therefore bounded. Hundreds of workers died from silicosis and related conditions after the Hawk's Nest project. 764 is the most widely used later estimate in scholarship, public history, and the memorial. Higher figures appear in federal and popular accounts. The precise toll cannot be stated with certainty. Any title or narration that announces one number as the recovered final truth would exceed the surviving evidence. The factual question has a firmer answer. The tunnel exposed workers to extreme concentrations of silica-rich dust. The danger of silica and methods of control were known. The congressional subcommittee found extensive dry drilling, inadequate ventilation, lack of respirators for contractor employees, and disregard for preventive methods. Workers developed rapid and fatal lung disease. These conclusions rest on multiple kinds of evidence and do not depend on the highest mortality estimate. The responsibility question also has a bounded answer. Reinhardt and Dennis employed the tunnel workers and controlled construction methods. The new Kanawha Power Company developed the project, kept engineers on site, and was connected to Union Carbide's industrial system. State regulation treated the work as civil construction rather than mining. Doctors, courts, and compensation rules shaped what happened after exposure. Responsibility was distributed, but distribution does not mean absence. The contractor's daily role is central. The committee placed negligence directly on the employing contractor and condemned the methods used. The power company's knowledge and control remain part of the record, particularly through engineering staff, contracts, geological information, and the project's industrial benefit. A documentary can explain those connections without claiming that every decision originated in one corporate office. The motive question requires the most restraint. Dry drilling saved time and labor. Silica extracted from the tunnel had industrial value. The power project had a deadline and economic purpose. These facts establish incentives. They do not reveal the private thoughts of every manager. The historical judgment should rest on conduct and known risk, not invented inner monologue. The concealment question requires the same discipline. Company documents defended low figures. Contractor officials declined voluntary appearance before the subcommittee. Witnesses described missing or destroyed records. Later researchers encountered gaps. These facts support conclusions about institutional self-protection and incomplete disclosure. They do not prove one coordinated act that secretly removed every victim from history. In a sense, a single conspiracy would make the story easier. It would provide one actor, one plan, and one moment of exposure. Hawk's Nest is harder because ordinary boundaries did much of the work. A contractor could say the workers belonged to its payroll. An owner could point to the contractor. A doctor could record pneumonia. A registrar could record a death without employment history. A state could apply a filing deadline. An undertaker could bury a pauper. Each action might be explained locally while the national pattern vanished. The system did not need everyone to agree. It needed each institution to stop where its own responsibility ended. The workers' disease crossed those stopping points. That is why the record gap is a causal consequence rather than an archival accident. The emotional question begins there. What is owed to a person who cannot be fully recovered by name? A historian cannot invent an identity to make the list feel complete. A memorial cannot wait for perfect proof before acknowledging mass death. The ethical answer has to hold recognition and uncertainty at the same time. Recognition means saying that the absence of a name does not make the life less real. It means explaining why some people were more likely to vanish from records. It means refusing to use uncertainty as an excuse to retreat to the lowest convenient number. It also means refusing to turn probable cases into certainty, merely to make the tragedy appear larger. Uncertainty can be precise. We can identify its sources. We can say which population a number includes, which dates it covers, which diagnoses it accepts, and what geography it reaches. We can distinguish documented cases from attributed memories and strong inference. We can tell viewers what remains unknown without treating the unknown as a void. That precision changes how the graves are seen. A field with unmarked burials is not proof of a complete death toll. It is proof that some deaths reached burial without durable identity. The later cemetery is not the location of every victim. It is a physical witness to a system that could move remains more reliably than it could restore names. It changes how the hearing page is seen as well. 476 written in federal type is not a final census. It is proof that the crisis had crossed the threshold into national recognition. The page can support the title because the title promises an unresolved count, not a solved one. The opening confirms that the number was official and incomplete. The body explains the mechanisms. The ending preserves the boundary. It changes how the company report is read. A defensive source can still contain indispensable evidence. Its lists can restore names. Its narrow categories can reveal the institution's boundaries. The historian does not have to choose between trusting the report completely and discarding it completely. Source criticism asks what the document was built to do and what it could not see. This method matters beyond Hawk's Nest. Many occupational disasters do not happen in one instant. Workers leave before disease appears. Contractors change. Plants close. Diagnoses evolve. The people with the greatest exposure may have the least stable records. A final count may be impossible, even when causation at the population level is clear. Public debate often treats numerical uncertainty as a reason for inaction. If experts disagree between hundreds, an institution can imply that nothing is known. Hawk's Nest demonstrates the error. Uncertainty around the perimeter can coexist with certainty at the center. The air was dangerous. Controls were known. Protection was unequal and inadequate. Disease followed. The exact number of resulting deaths is the unresolved perimeter. The opposite error is to treat the largest estimate as a moral requirement. That can make correction feel like betrayal. If new evidence changes an estimate, the human judgment should not collapse with it. A history built on transparent methods can absorb revision. A history built on one dramatic number becomes fragile. The workers deserve a story strong enough to survive revision. Their significance does not depend on winning a ranking against other disasters. Their deaths do not become less important if one estimate changes. The central injustice is already documented in the conditions under which they worked, and the failure to protect or follow them. The scale still matters. Hundreds of deaths transform individual negligence into institutional catastrophe. The count tells us that the harm was not an exceptional accident involving a few unlucky men. It was a pattern generated by the way the project operated. The range preserves that scale without manufacturing precision. The names matter differently. A total can demonstrate magnitude. A name restores relation. Eugene Abraham, James Alexander, Robert Allison, and the other people preserved by the archive are not examples invented for a script. They are entries connected to records of age, race, burial, or death. Some have fuller documentation than others. Each recovered identity narrows the distance between the person and the number. The archive's incompleteness should remain visible beside those names. A viewer should not mistake a current online list for the full dead. The project explicitly asks families and researchers to add information. Its open form recognizes that the last archival act may come from a descendant rather than an institution. This changes the ending from closure to responsibility. The count cannot be closed, but the record can still be improved. A new certificate can be linked. A variant spelling can be reconciled. A grave location can be documented. A corporate table can be re-examined. The work is finite at the level of each claim, even if the total remains open. That claim-by-claim work also reveals what different sources can and cannot do. A death certificate can connect a name, a place, a date, and a recorded cause. It may never mention the tunnel. A payroll can show that a man worked for the contractor. It may end before his illness began. A lawsuit can preserve symptoms and employment history. It represents the people who found counsel and entered court, not everyone who became sick. A cemetery record can establish burial while leaving the cause uncertain. A family memory can preserve a worker whom formal systems lost. It may carry a spelling or date that needs reconciliation. A company report can list cases while defending the company that created it. A congressional hearing can test many records at once. It can still stop before the missing witnesses appear. No single source deserves the entire burden of proof. The record becomes stronger when independent traces meet. A payroll name joined to testimony, a death certificate, and a grave entry is different from a name found in only one table. That does not make the single trace worthless. It tells us how firmly each conclusion can be stated. The same discipline applies to silence. An absent name can mean that a worker used another spelling, left before a list was compiled, died outside the search area, or survived. It cannot by itself prove death. An absent diagnosis can reflect error, limited medicine, deliberate avoidance, or a genuinely different cause. Silence becomes evidence only when the system that produced it is understood. This is why the disappearance cannot be described as one empty archive. There are many partial archives whose boundaries overlap imperfectly. The contractor saw employment. Doctors saw patients. Courts saw claims. Registrars saw local deaths. Families saw lives extending before and after the project. Congress saw a national problem. Later historians tried to join those views. The joining process has its own risks. Two spellings may refer to one person. Two similar names may refer to different people. A man recorded as a laborer in one place may have worked another job elsewhere. A diagnosis of tuberculosis may conceal silicosis, coexist with it, or be correct on its own. The desire to restore a victim cannot replace the need to identify him carefully. Care is not hesitation for its own sake. It is how recovery avoids creating another form of erasure. If two people are collapsed into one record, one disappears. If one person is counted twice, the total gains false authority. If a family account is rejected because it lacks corporate paperwork, the same institutional boundary is reproduced. Each source has to be heard in the language it can actually speak. That approach makes uncertainty productive. Instead of asking only which total is right, researchers can ask which workers each total excludes. They can ask where a list begins, when it ends, how it defines disease, and whose movement it could follow. The differences between totals then become a map of institutional vision. The narrow figure shows the reach of a company-linked record. The congressional figure shows the reach of a national investigation that knew it was unfinished. The later estimate shows what broader reconstruction could recover. The higher belief shows that even this recovery may not reach the outer edge. The disagreement is not noise surrounding the story. It is part of the story's evidence. There is also responsibility in how images are used. Historic photographs of tunnel crews show real people, but captions may not identify everyone. Generated reconstructions can illustrate dust, labor, and landscape, but they are not evidence and should not mimic a named person. A document image should use the real hearing page rather than fabricated official text. A memorial image should not imply that every victim lies beneath it. These rules may seem separate from the historical argument. They are the same argument. Hawk's Nest is a story about what happens when representation outruns the person. The documentary must not repeat that harm by creating false faces, false records, or false certainty for a stronger click. The strongest package therefore divides its labor. The title names Congress, the number, Hawk's Nest, and the count that did not close. The human thumbnail shows workers moving away and states that many died elsewhere. The opening places the resolution beside the reasons tabulation failed. The script then travels backward into the tunnel and forward through medicine, law, burial, and memory. The ending returns to the operating structure and the open archive. Every part repays the same promise. Congress did not simply fail to add correctly. It inherited a workforce already fragmented by the organization of the project. The famous number was a public recognition of scale, not a completed list. Later estimates rose because later researchers widened the population and caused rules. They still could not recover everyone. The phrase "many died elsewhere" is important because it identifies the direction of disappearance without claiming every absent worker died. Some men left and survived. Some lived for years with impairment. Some deaths were unrelated. The phrase belongs to a documented pattern, not a universal fate. Its purpose is to show why a West Virginia count could never contain the whole event. The tunnel's continued operation creates the final contrast. The water can be measured today. Engineers can know its route, flow, and output. The men who created that route cannot all be measured with the same precision. The structure has an unbroken function. The workforce has a broken record. It would be comforting to believe that later safety law completed the moral circuit. Hawk's Nest helped make acute silicosis visible. Occupational health agencies still cite it. Dust control became a recognized obligation. Those developments matter. They do not convert suffering into a necessary sacrifice. No worker had to die for silica to become scientifically dangerous. The danger was already known. The deaths forced institutions to acknowledge what knowledge without enforcement had failed to prevent. The distinction matters because it places responsibility on those institutions, rather than assigning historical purpose to the victims. The same is true of the congressional hearing. Its eloquence and outrage should not conceal its limits. The subcommittee found enough to condemn and not enough to finish. It asked for books, witnesses, authority, and a fuller inquiry. The request is one of the most revealing documents in the case. It shows a government recognizing that its own record was incomplete. The story can now answer its three questions. What happened is settled at the level necessary for judgment. Workers drilling the Hawk's Nest tunnel inhaled extraordinary silica dust under conditions the House subcommittee found preventable and grossly unsafe. Hundreds died, and many more were sickened. Why the public numbers conflict is also explainable. They count different populations with different evidence, dates, diagnoses, and geographic limits. The lowest company-linked figure rests on narrow records. The congressional figure made a broad crisis official. Cherniak's later estimate reconstructed a wider epidemic. Higher federal language expressed belief beyond that estimate. No surviving source contains every worker and every outcome. What remains emotionally unresolved is not whether the dead mattered. It is how to honor people whose names cannot all be restored. The answer is to refuse both erasure and invention. Preserve the range. Recover names where evidence permits. Mark graves without pretending to know more than the ground can tell. Keep the uncertainty attached to the system that produced it. Return at last to January of 1936. The clerk's page says 476. Beneath that number, the resolution asks for an inquiry, with access to records and power to compel evidence. The page carries its own contradiction. It names the dead before the government has built a way to find them. The hearing continues for weeks. Workers describe dust. A father describes the breath he no longer has. An engineer describes masks that ordinary crews did not receive. Doctors explain a disease that can move faster than expected. The committee condemns the work and asks to see the books it still lacks. Then, the printed volume closes. The tunnel does not close. Water enters Gauley Mountain and continues toward Alloy. The cemetery holds remains whose full identities are uncertain. The archive holds names while inviting more. The numbers remain on markers, pages, and websites, each carrying the boundary of the source that made it. 476 was enough for Congress to recognize a national disaster. It was not enough to contain the men who went home sick, died under another diagnosis, or entered the ground without a durable name. The most honest final count is not a single number hidden somewhere in the archive. It is the documented space between what the institutions counted and the people their records could no longer reach.